Old school RuneScape is no longer old school. That is the main problem and the entire focus of this video. But first I need to clarify that there are two ways to interpret that statement. 1. The game no longer resembles a 2007 version of the game. We all know that, and every single RuneScape player already knows it. 2. The game no longer resembles the game that it used to be back in 2013, or even back when I began playing back in 2015. And that's the problem. The game that we all fell in love with back in the pivotal years of 2013 to 2016, that game is dead. I know that some people like to point out that OSRS would have died had it not been updated. But the thing is, the game used to get updates that were more old school in nature. But that is no longer the case. And in the span of about 4 years, the game has completely changed direction and it no longer resembles what it used to be. I know that's a lot to explain, and there will be a lot to explain, but to really understand the problem you kind of have to do a lot of explaining. So if you don't want to hear me go in depth about this topic, then now is your chance to leave. I think the most glaring problem is the new skill. They really don't have to add a new skill. They can add content elsewhere or implement it in a different way like they always have. I know the team have their own reasons for making it a new skill, but I really don't see how you can justify adding an update that fundamentally changes the entire game in exchange for some content that looks decent at best. Like, how many new fishing methods does the game need? Why do we need a new skill when minigames are mostly dead? The new content that you get from sailing isn't gonna be less fun if it's not a skill, so I just don't buy it. And then there's an even bigger problem. The moment that sailing passes, they are gonna start working on a second skill, shamanism. I actually had to look up that name while writing this. That name is so stupid. I know sailing hasn't passed yet, but when was the last time that a new piece of content failed the poll? Regardless of how bad it is. Even the new prayers that were so bad they all had to get scrapped, all passed the poll. I know they didn't poll the rework, but the bad versions of the prayers still passed. Anyway, shamanism takes a lot of the core concepts from warding, herblore, and summoning. The main idea of the skill is basically gathering herblore secondaries. How is that fun? It's not, dude. And the idea of going to the spirit realm to do stuff isn't fun either. Shamanism is genuinely one of the worst ideas the developers have ever come up with, taming being arguably the worst in my opinion. I keep saying that the new skills are a problem, and what I mean by that is, skills are like stats in any RPG, and that's by design. If you remove something like intelligence or personality from Morrowind, suddenly you're playing a fundamentally different game. Same thing applies to OSRS. So many interactions are gonna be influenced by the addition of a new skill, altering the entire foundation that the game is built upon. Whether people like to admit it or not, a lot of the appeal from OSRS comes from the fact that it is old school. Grinds take 50 hours instead of 50 minutes, and you're not always rewarded with equipment that's better than what you already have. Not to mention, there's also a lot of appeal coming from the fact that the game is recognizable, so now suddenly you're adding something that's completely unrecognizable. That's really what I'm trying to get at. A new skill could have been fine on its own, but there's already been so many fundamental changes over the past couple of years. Think about what the game used to be like back in 2015. It was more simple and the economy was a lot better. You could do the content that you wanted to do because the money you made was significant. You were not obligated to do certain skills to get some diary requirements or whatever. People enjoyed skilling for what it was, and people only did skilling because they liked skilling. Well, for the most part. The diary thing was released in pretty early of the game's lifespan, actually. But even then, the skilling requirements were not that high. PVMing was also a lot different. But the thing is, talking about how PVM used to be doesn't really convey how bad it is now. Look at the new prayers that were proposed. They were so bad that they scrapped the prayer book entirely. Of course, it still passed a poll, so what purpose did a poll serve anyway? If people are voting yes to garbage updates that not even the developers want to add, that's kind of a big problem. It shows that polls literally do not work as intended. You can't filter out bad content with polling anymore. So what are they gonna do about that? Nothing. They are doing nothing about it. It's actually really stupid. What they should have done is increase the amount of yes votes required for a poll to pass to 80% instead of reducing it to 70%. Another bad update is the Karasi sword. People deliberately voted on it having 50% special attack cost instead of 60. So now it's basically a direct replacement for Dragon Claws at most places. I think that's pretty stupid. Not to mention how powerful it is in PvP. The new wildy bosses are also really stupid. The backwards implementation of having the best versions of the bosses located below 30 wilderness has killed any potential the update might have had. Now it's basically impossible to find a world because you're constantly competing with gold farmers and bots. And that is really bad for people who just want to play the game and have fun. Obviously the low level versions should be the least desirable, but somehow they managed to do the opposite. I know a lot of people don't like Cerberus, Abyssal Sire and a lot of the older bosses, but if you take a look at what those updates brought to the game compared to the newer stuff, you'll see that they barely changed the PvMing meta. Even Theater of Blood had a lot of thought put into it. The scythe was one of the best items in the game when it came out, but it was really expensive to use and it's really expensive to buy as well. The rapier was best in slot, but it didn't outright replace everything that came before it. It wasn't even that much better than the Abyssal Tentacle. Even the Avernic Defender isn't that powerful compared to the Dragon Defender. Justiciar armor isn't actually that powerful either. Compare that to the Voidwaker, a weapon that just straight up changed the entire PKing scene and replaced Dragon Claws. Not to mention TOA's drop table, which gave us another tectonic change to the entire PvM scene. The Fang is practically a scythe, but better. It's also dropped much more frequently, which is not even what it was intended to be, but they only gave it a tiny nerf that didn't even reduce the DPS by that much. People seem to think otherwise, but go look up some DPS calculations and you'll see it's still too powerful. Not to mention how cheap it is. Older updates didn't radically change how the entire game plays. Dumping new content that devalues everything that came before it isn't something that used to happen before Nightmare's release. Everything before that had some amount of foresight put into it. Maybe not the T-bow, but it's been 6 years since then, so let's move on. On the skilling side of things you have Forestry, which I used to be neutral on, but I've changed my mind. It's horrible and the game would be better off without it. It could have been a good update, but they decided to stuff it full of garbage. 2 pet transmogs for the same pet. Bonfires, 2 high XP rates, and they just had to make it such a stupid update. I'm actually glad I got 200 mil woodcutting before they added all this garbage. And yeah, it's technically optional, but who is gonna say no to free GP and XP, unless you wanna do redwoods. There's also a Nex and TOA and the Phantom Muspa, which are all terrible pieces of content that I hate doing. But I don't want to make this video too long, so I'll just say, after learning Theater of Blood, most other endgame PvM updates look kinda lame in comparison. It might honestly be one of the most fun pieces of content in the entire game. And that's saying a lot, because I actually love a good 80% of the game's content already, including skilling. There's a good reason why I have played this game for over 16,000 hours. I would talk about the recent good updates that have been added, like the Jagex launcher finally giving us better security and all that, and most people really seem to like the Desert Treasure 2 bosses, and the bosses did bring a lot of interesting mechanics. But I don't know, I feel like good updates should be a given. The game always got good updates in the past. I used to vote yes to most polls, but that's not really the case anymore, and that's kind of sad. So far I touched on a lot of points, but basically there's been a lot of bad updates over the past couple of years. And this is a trend that's only been continuing. Not all the updates are bad, like I said, but the main concern is the direction of the game that the game has been going in. With all that in mind, how do we fix this problem? Back in June, Jagex released a blog post called The Future of the Ruinous Powers, which everyone should read for themselves if you haven't already. But the most notable part about the entire blog is that they basically said bad updates will pass if they're pulled. They actually said that. It's the biggest reason why they didn't pull the reworked versions of the new prayer book, because polls don't work. They specifically said that updates that are bad for the game would pass if they are pulled. If you don't know the implications of that, the entire reason why polling exists in the first place is to weed out bad updates. And here they are, admitting that polls no longer serve that purpose. I really can't overstate how much of a problem that is. The result of this problem is that polling pretty much doesn't exist. There is nothing left to prevent Jagex from adding garbage content. Jagex does have some idea on how to handle power creep and other various things, but as it stands, whenever something new and fancy is pulled, it's going to pass. It doesn't matter if it's good for the game or even if it belongs in the game in the first place. It's going to be added because there's no one left to say no. When I said, how do we fix this problem, what I really meant was, there is no feasible way for the game to recover from the current state that it's in. Also, it's pretty much a guarantee that sailing will pass, and I would bet that even shamanism would pass, even though it's garbage. They have gone full circle in repeating the same mistakes that Runescape 3 did. Even the game's economy is really bad now. The money you make from skilling is basically nothing unless you're doing sepulcher. The money you make from most bosses is also garbage unless you're raiding or killing necks. This also creates a problem with bond prices. When gold is worth nothing, bonds become more expensive, and bonds have been going up and up for years. This greatly hurts low and mid-level players, and even skillers. Like, imagine making 200,000 GP per hour training some random skills. To get 8 million for a bot, you would have to play 40 hours in the span of 14 days. So if you go to school or have a job like most people do, then I guess you're screwed. You can't play the game the way you want to thanks to the economy. You have to train your stats up and do some budget PVMing just to get by. You should not be obligated to do that if you just want to play the game for free. Also, I'm pretty sure membership prices have also gone up over the years. So even if you want to pay, you're paying more. So that's cool. RuneScape 3 also has a similar problem. The entire game is focused and balanced around the endgame. It kinda goes without saying, but RuneScape 3 is the last thing that Oversaris should be like. Repeating their mistakes goes against everything that old school RuneScape is. Some people might disagree on that, but those people are wrong, and it doesn't take a lot of thinking to figure out why that is. Anyway, there's also a problem adjacent to polling, and that is the player base. I'll try to keep it short, but you are just gonna have to believe me when I say this, but the reason why Oversaris has such a high player count is because Jagex has in the past couple of years been pushing out a lot of content updates. Like I said, these updates have had all sorts of problems, but that doesn't really affect player retention unless you just outright break the game. EOC and the removal of free trade are probably the only updates in the game's history to have done that. As one of the comments on my last rant said, right before the bubble pops, people keep pushing for easier gameplay so that they can beat it and move on to the next. People want the game to become easier, people want better rewards, and people want more rewards, and people are not willing to vote no to any of it. With every new update, the game becomes easier and more endgame focused, which I already talked about earlier. The end result of all of this is that people get complacent. They get used to having several massive game-changing content updates every year. This might be good in the short term, but this is basically the tipping point to any MMORPG. When you start making content for people who don't actually like the game and don't want to play it, people who need a new, shiny, best-in-slot item to play with, or else they get bored. People who don't care about good content, only new content. When those are the only types of people left playing the game, it's basically gonna be dead. You already see this with games like New World. Everybody was playing it. Now almost nobody does. Old school RuneScape was supposed to be different from games like that, but if Jagex doesn't care about maintaining the integrity of older content and would rather make a rollercoaster type MMORPG, then it's really not the same game anymore. And you know what happens with those types of players? They leave. They leave, and they leave fast if you can't keep up. That is what focusing on the short-term player count gets you. And I think everybody knows it, but Jagex doesn't want to acknowledge it. They want to cater to both sides and keep old school players, but also get in a ton of new ones. But that is not how that works. And I feel like Jagex should not be oblivious to that fact. So that's it. These are all the reasons why old school RuneScape is no longer old school. In summary, the game really had a lot going for it, but for some reason they decided to crap all over the older content with the newer, worse content, alongside all the fundamental changes that make the game feel less and less old school, which makes a lot of the old school players wonder why they stick around. And it's not just me. I got so many comments on the last video from people who feel the exact same way and had never heard anyone talk about these problems before, and I find that kind of surprising. I think there should be more people appreciating the game that they have instead of trying to turn the game into something that people are eventually gonna give up on. Back in the day, you would never see Jagex catering to people who don't actually want to play the game. But now, I guess Jagex needs the game to have 100k players at all time. So they keep hiring more and more people and try to facilitate growth by doing really stupid things. Of course, I've only been playing old school RuneScape since I was a kid. Not just RuneScape, but old school RuneScape. So what do I know? I'm just a bitter old man who can't accept changes, even though I have been accepting of the changes that have come to the game for almost 10 years. Sailing, on the other hand, is just change for the sake of change, and the game doesn't really benefit from it. The only benefit it has is that Jagex gets to advertise it and something like that. But if they really cared, they would have added it in a different kind of way. So what will I do? I might honestly quit. Like I said, I love old school RuneScape and most of what the game has to offer, but if Jagex cares so little about the good content, then why should I care about it? I do want an Infernal Cape still, and along with a couple 200 mils. Right now I'm working on 200 mil farming, Slayer, cooking, possibly thieving as well. I really enjoy those grinds and I probably won't quit before I get at least a couple of those things done. But beyond that, I really don't know. By the time I get my next 200 mil, the game that I love might be completely gone. It's kinda sad really. You don't realize how good the game was until Jagex tries to ruin it, just like they did before. So all in all, that is why old school RuneScape is no longer old school. Also, the most important takeaway from this video is that polling is broken and Jagex needs to fix it, instead of just acknowledging that it doesn't serve its own purpose anymore. Like seriously, you need to fix polling. Increase it from 70% yes votes required to 80%. Just do it, please.